One of the biggest problems you have in climbing photography, if you're working on a cliff, like if that's the cliff and you're abseiling down the cliff and you're trying to take photographs of someone, well, sometimes the best angle isn't like just on the cliff. You actually want to be sort of out from the cliff sometimes to get a perspective looking down to capture that sort of rock architecture. So, and if the cliff's vertical and there's nothing there to, attach another rope to pull out, or you can't get out.
Hey everyone, I'm Matt Payne, and this is episode 449 of F-Stop, Collaborate, and Listen, a podcast that goes far beyond camera gear with candid, in-depth conversations exploring creativity, motivation, inspiration, and the craft of photography. Each week, I sit down with professional photographers, industry insiders, and passionate creatives to dig into the why behind the work, from business and marketing to mindset and artistic growth. With a particular focus on landscape, nature, and wildlife photography, we also explore hot topics shaping the photo industry today. My guest this week is Simon Carter, a legendary climbing photographer who has been documenting the sport for over 3 decades. In our conversation, we talk about the keys to sustaining a long career in a highly specialized niche, how Simon developed a personal compass that's guided his work, and the role that climbing guidebooks have played in helping him build a remarkable body of photography. We also dig into his latest book, The Art of Climbing, his creative approach to balancing the climber, the setting, and the rock itself, and the unique tools and techniques that he's developed to capture some of the sport's most iconic images. Whether you're a climber, a landscape photographer, or simply someone who appreciates dedication to a craft, there's a lot to take away from this one. Before we get going, I have a quick favor to ask. If you're enjoying these episodes, hit pause and visit patreon.com/fstop and listen to support the show. Or take a moment and leave a thoughtful 5-star review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. It would mean the world to me. Thank you. Okay, here's my conversation with Simon Carter. All right, Simon Carter, it's great to have you on the podcast.
G'day, Matt. Thank you so much for having me on. It's a pleasure to be here.
Yeah, I always love talking with our friends down in Australia because A, you're in the future, which is cool because you can tell us what it's like tomorrow, but B, it's great to hear your guys' perspective on photography.
Down under perspective. Well, I like to hear your perspective because, American outdoors photography has always been very influential to me. So I'm looking forward to this conversation. Yeah, thanks.
Awesome. Well, Simon, for people who aren't familiar with you and your photography, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself?
Okay, thanks, Matt. I'm Simon Carter. I'm 58-year-old Australian. I live in the Blue Mountains, which is near Sydney. It's a beautiful sort of rock climbing area, and I specialise in rock climbing photography. I somehow managed to keep my obsession with rock climbing photography going for about 30 years now and managed to make a living doing it and still going.
What did you do before rock climbing photography?
Well, let me start at the beginning, right? So I grew up in Canberra and I got into photography when I was 15. So I just was a 15-year-old growing up in suburban Canberra and I just became obsessed with photography, and I just thought there was 2 elements to it. One was I just became really fascinated with the medium of photography. I'd sort of walk the streets at night doing sort of nightscapes, and I'd get my friends to model for me. And I just became fascinated with the medium, and I built my own darkroom when I was 15 in the laundry in my parents' house. The other thing that really struck me about photography was that I just thought photographers had the best jobs, which to me, as a 15-year-old boy, I just thought that would inevitably involve travelling the world and going to beautiful and exotic places, possibly hanging out with models and photographing them on beaches and stuff. So I'm just being honest, like as a 15-year-old boy, that sounded really appealing to me. And so I thought, yeah, photographers have the best jobs. I'd love to do that one day. And I just love the medium. So I really got into it when I was 15. And I just went, oh, I want to be a photographer. So that was photography. But when I was 16, that's sort of when I got really into rock climbing. And I was already really into the outdoors with my mates. We had a little group and we'd go on these quite adventurous bushwalks and stuff when we were 15, 16. And one day I was in the school library. It was a really good library, and I found these two books. It was Everest the Hard Way by Chris Bonington, and the other book was The White Spider, which you might know is a classic tale, mountaineering tale of the first ascent of the North Face of the Eiger in the Swiss Alps. And so these were two books of like classic mountaineering literature. I just thought, that's it, mountaineering, that's the ultimate sport. I was a skinny little guy and I was not good at football and team sports, and I just thought, mountaineering, that's the ultimate sport, that's what I want to do. And so I just really got into rock climbing when I was 16.
Awesome. Like, at what point did you combine the two?
Yeah, so it took probably about 10 years. I had those two passions, and, when I was 16, I kind of had a dream maybe you could combine those two things, but I didn't see how it possible. So I just thought I wanted to be a photographer, and I convinced my parents to let me change high school for the last 2 years of high school. So because they had the best photography course in Canberra, and it was there I really got into rock climbing as well. So at that high school, by the time I'd finished, those two passions were fully cemented, and I got my first job straight out of high school in photography. I was very lucky, and I ended up working for 2 years at the Australian National University in some of their photography departments, which was actually pretty boring in the end. I actually ended up spending about 80% of my time in this tiny little dark room. And it was a research school of biological sciences. So all the scientists, they'd bring me these electron microscope photographs, like those DNA gel smears. You know those DNA gel smears where the little banding they get to show the DNA? So it's basically a really badly exposed negative, medium format negative. And so I sat in a dark room all day printing these little black and white bands, really badly exposed negatives on paper for the scientists for their research. And I wasn't involved in the research. And just after doing this for 2 years, it just absolutely killed my passion for photography. I just couldn't see how doing that, working in a dark room, would ever kind of lead to the kind of photography that I wanted to do. It was so far from travelling the world. I learned, it's funny, looking back, it was actually a really valuable lesson in life, I guess. I thought that was the road to get into photography, and I pursued that, and it was a dead end, but it was a valuable lesson. It was sort of like, that's what I don't want to do if I do photography. I actually want to be a photographer out there shooting. So after I'd been working for 2 years in a darkroom straight out of high school, the other thing I did is I did night school photography, because I thought, while I'm working, I'll get technically good. And that absolutely killed my desire for photography, because we had to hand in a final portfolio of 12 photographs. And so I went, beauty, 12 rock climbing photographs for my final portfolio, and they failed me.
Oh, wow.
And again, it was a blessing in disguise, because I just thought, oh, bugger that. The photos that did really well in that course was like nudes on rocky beaches and like really contrived stuff in the studio. And I just thought, it's so unoriginal, uninspiring, and so lazy. Because when I do climbing photographs, you have to hike out to a cliff and abseil down and go to quite a lot of work, and it's sometimes quite scary. So that all led to my disillusion after 2 years. So I completely gave up my dream of being a photographer. I gave up for about 8 years. I got into outdoor education. I did a degree, and I thought I'd take kids bushwalking and abseiling and canoeing and skiing, teach them about the outdoors. But then after doing that course, I realised I didn't really want to work with kids. That was probably better for others. And so I just ended up working in outdoor shops for a couple of years and just got more and more into my rock climbing and just tried to get as good as I could. After 2 years, I saved up some money, and I was 26 years old, and I went and lived in a tent at this climbing area in Australia called Mount Arapiles, which was like the mecca in the 1990s for going rock climbing. So if you wanted to be a good rock climber, you just go there and live and just climb all the time. And that's what I did for 8 months, and I got really good at rock climbing. But on my rest days, and I needed lots of rest days, I started taking photos again. My friends were some of the best climbers in the country, and the place, Mount Arapiles, and the nearby, the Grampians National Park, was so spectacular. And I just started taking photos, and I needed money to pay for film, and so I started getting photos published, and I just got to this point in life, what next? I've done my climbing thing, and I really want to do this photography thing, and it was a literal aha moment, like climbing photography, this is it, this is my time. And I did a small business course, I got a small grant from the government, and I started a business. And this is in 1994, and I was about 27 or something. I started my business, and 3 months later, I went on the road taking photos. I published an Australian climbing calendar within 3 months of starting my business, and that gave me enough income to keep going for the second year. And that's been the story of my last 31 years of just scraping through and just, yeah, that's...
For people who aren't watching, like, you have this background behind you that's full of climbing magazines and the covers of those magazines, which I'm assuming are like all of your photographs, which is pretty amazing.
Yeah, I just started out like 31 years ago and just kept going. I think I kept publishing a calendar for 20 years, and a publisher came to me and I got my first coffee table book out after 4 years, and then I just self-published, and yeah, just kept going.
So it sounds like your success has just been persistence.
So the key to success, I think, well, if you call it success, because, define success, please. Let's.
I was going to say, in this industry, I feel like success is like, I can pay my mortgage.
Yeah, and that's probably about my measure of success if I get through that each month. So, I'm an Australian climbing photographer, so, to be fair, I've managed to stay in business because I probably get a lot of my income from the US, because the outdoors and climbing, and that's just where the market for photography is. But being in Australia, it's had its advantages, but it's had its disadvantages. So there's the passion, but there's definitely the financial thing, like how do you sustain it? And so what happened to me is after I'd been doing it for a few years, and the publisher came to me and we did a book, and then that led to other things, and I started photographing overseas. But the one thing that really happened is I got into producing rock climbing guidebooks in about the year 2000. And, I've produced a ton of guidebooks since then. Like, there are just a ton of work, photographing the cliffs, doing all the design and stuff. But that has been actually really good for my photography career. It's helped with the financial stability that I've needed to be able to just go off and photograph what I want to photograph. But the guidebooks have also been really good because I've focused my photography. They kept it focused on rock climbing photography, and that's given me opportunity to travel around to lots of really good climbing areas and spend a lot of time in them and get to know them really well, which is, obviously very beneficial for when you're doing the high-end climbing photographs. So, yeah, I think in a funny way, the guidebooks is what kept me going, and it kept me focused, but it also kept me from becoming so successful in other ways that I might have got distracted. Do you know what I mean? I know a lot of climbing photographers from my generation who started back in the 1990s. And if you look at their careers, a lot gave up after a few years. But others went on to become really quite successful. And you know a lot of the names, American climbing photographers, the Jimmy Chins and Keith Lesinskis. A lot of American climbing photographers have become quite successful moving into video.
Right.
And I just did my guidebook thing and my calendar thing, and I guess actually the coffee table book thing. So I managed to start traveling the world to different rock climbing areas, and that's pretty exciting. So it's not hard to keep the passion going.
Well, and as they say, there's riches and niches, and I feel like climbing photography is definitely a niche. I mean, there's a lot of people out there who are super enthusiastic about rock climbing and mountaineering, and I feel like if your photography is hyper-focused on that, you're going to have a lot of really passionate fans that are eager to follow your work.
That's right. It is a niche, and that's an advantage and a disadvantage.
I was going to say, I was kind of nodding along as you were talking about the guidebook, because I published a hiking and climbing guidebook for the San Juans of Colorado here, and everything you said resonated with me. And also, like, my photography, I have been distracted. Like, I love too many different things in photography. So like if I would have stayed super hyper focused on just Colorado mountains and just being known for that and just for that, it probably would have worked out better for me in some ways, but in other ways, I think I would have maybe gotten a little bit bored with it too. So I'd be curious to hear you talk a little bit about how you keep it excited, keep it interesting, keep from getting bored in creating those images.
There's a couple of aspects of the vision thing or a mission thing that I've always had. When I was able to start travelling to climbing areas, it's pretty hard not to be excited. But I always had a vision from the very early days of trying to build up a body of work. So every time I travelled to a climbing area, I'd try to come up with just at least one photo that was really, top notch. And I'd put a lot of effort into that. And I realised that it was a long process, but I did have a vision from early on that if I just kept doing that every time I travelled or every area I went to, I tried to pull off the best photo I possibly could, then maybe one day it would come into a body of work which might mean something more than just a single image or something.
It seems like having that compass or vision, if you will, has really helped you stay focused on the end goal for all of these years.
I mean, it does go kind of almost back to, I think there was a book that came out in it was a book called Rocks Around the World. It was by a German photographer, and it featured a German climber called Stefan Glauwitsch, who was one of the big names in world climbing. The book was just of this one climber, and they travelled to 5 different climbing areas around the world and spent a month at each taking climbing photographs. And it was a beautiful book. It was a groundbreaking book. It was stunning, but I had several things in my mind that always kind of bugged me. It was always just one climber, so no matter how interesting that climber is, after all, you keep seeing photos of that one person. I thought that kind of gets a bit tiring. And I just thought, 1 month at each area and that's your book. It felt kind of lazy, like it'd always come up with a couple of classic shots from each area, but then and I always had in this vision, since seeing that book, what I want to do one day is a book that works with as many different climbers as possible from as many different areas in the world, that showcases the best climbs and no fillers, like just photo of just the best that I could do. And that was the book that I had come out last year. The Art of Climbing was basically that. So I did have that vision. Yeah.
Yeah, I'd love for you to talk more about the book. Like, what were some of the visual concepts that you wanted to explore in the book, and maybe walk us through what you were trying to accomplish with it?
Yeah, so I think most rock climbing photo books, and the previous 4 that I'd done, I'd call them destination books. So the chapters are kind of basically based on areas. So, my first book, Rock Climbing in Australia, there was 23 climbing areas around Australia, and just organised by chapters, and you might have someone write an introduction talking about the area or something. And so that was my 4 previous books. And so about 2 years ago, it's such a long story, but I ended up at a point in life, I'd basically completed my body of work after about, 30 years. And along came COVID, along came divorce, along came, all sorts of stuff around the year 2000 that I think threw a lot of people's lives into disarray. And I had that body of work, but a crazy thing that came out of that is I ended up one day through a video that somebody shot of me, of my photography, and they only could have shot this video. It was a journalist, and he said, because of COVID, I need to shoot a story outside. And so he came and shot this story of me doing rock climbing photographs for a series he was doing on different photographers. Anyway, this journalist shot a video, and the publishers in London at Thames and Hudson saw it, and next thing I knew, I had a contract out of the blue to do a book of my life's work, just when I'd finally build up my body of life's work. So it was just perfect. And
wow.
So anyway, I'm at this point about 2 years ago where I'm sitting down with my body of work, my life's work, and it's, oh, wow, how do I present this body of work now? My life's work. How do I want to present that? I don't want to do it like my previous books. I don't want it to be just another destination book. I want it to say something a bit different, a bit special. One of the things I'd always kept in my mind when I'd go out shooting is what is special or unique about this scene or situation or this place or this climb or this climber? What is special about this that I want to emphasise visually in the photograph, that visual element? And I realised over the years, I'd been doing this subconsciously. I'd been looking for what was special or unique and emphasising that in my compositions. And so I realised I had a body of work where each individual photograph I'd been looking for the unique thing. And then how do you make sense of these, 300 images of your best work and present that? So didn't want to do destination, so we went through this process with the publishers and they were awesome. So should we arrange it chronologically? My life's work. Should we start at the start and finish at the finish? And as a photographer, I thought, yeah, it's my life's work, that makes sense. But no, as a viewer, as a reader, who cares? Yeah, so we went through a process. Well, should we divide these images up visually by rock type? Or I looked at that, limestone, sandstone. No, it's not what climbing's about. Should we split it up by style of climbing? Big walls, trad, sport, or bouldering? No. And in the end, so I came back to that, well, what is it is unique? And we'd always had the art sort of theme in mind. I started looking, so I always came to my photography from a kind of anti-artistic kind of approach, if you call it. Like, I always try to be so straight in my compositions and not do sort of what you might call artsy things in, blurry or black and white or things that might typically be defined as arty. But I go for a really technically good image, like a landscape photographer would. You haven't really got an excuse for a non-technically good image, have you? So that's what I try to do with my climbing photography. But yeah, I started looking for the artistry in my photography. And I realised, so this is the thing, I realised there's three sort of essential visual elements in a rock climbing photograph that are emphasised. So it's either the climber, the setting, or the rock architecture. Right. As you imagine in a rock climbing photos, often you're zooming in close on the expression and what the climber's holding onto, and you might have an action shot. And a lot of the covers where it's the climber's big in the frame and there's lots of action. And then at the other extreme, you've got the climber really small in the frame, and it's like a landscape photograph where the setting is the most important thing in the frame. Then you've got the big thing in climbing photography, which is the rock architecture, and that's what has always inspired me about rock climbing photography, is the architecture you get to play with in those cliff environments. It's so cool. What I realised is when I looked at that, rock architecture. You've got formations, you've got corners, you've got arêtes, you've got cracks, dikes, coloured rock that runs through a scene, and you've got walls, big blank walls, you've got overhangs, the physical, visual elements. So the rock architecture to me is the thing about rock climbing photography that's really fun to play with visually. And yes, you've got the climber, and that can be all about the intensity, or at the other extreme, you've got the landscape, which is more what you do. And yeah, this is a bit different with climbing photography.
I'd love to hear you talk a little bit about how you balance those elements in a frame. Like, you're looking at a scene, you've got a climber hanging upside down from a crazy overhang, awesome geology on display. How do you pick and choose which one is more prominent, and how to balance the elements compositionally? Or going further than composition, like, how much visual weight does each hold within the frame?
So I think to explain that, I also think we need to touch on the concept of, I kind of think there's a spectrum with rock climbing photography. The landscape photography, you're probably planning each shoot. Maybe you're spontaneously reacting to the situation because you were there. But I think, I'm guessing for high-end landscape photography, you're probably planning it out. So
it depends. I mean, I'll say it depends on the photographer. Like me personally, no. But a lot of people do. I found more joy in just responding to what I encounter, but that's a completely different process.
Yeah, and that takes a lot of time. Being out there, it all takes a lot of time, because even if you're doing something really planned, you need to understand the area, the situation, the lighting, the conditions you want. In climbing photography, I think there's a spectrum between what I'd call documentary. You just go out, you work around the climbers. They're just doing it anyway. You're there to document it. Maybe they're trying something really hard and you just wait as they attempt it. But that's it. You're not directing anything. And at the other end, you have the more creative end, and that's the end I find really interesting. It's where you start with the concept. Which climb from this area would work best? Like, what climb would show what's really unique about this area, not just about this climb. And that's where I've had some of the most sort of satisfying shoots have been, where I've spent days trying to deconstruct that final image in my brain and figure out how to get the climber in the right place with the inversion layer of cloud in the valley below. And that's what I find really interesting. So now I need to get back to the question you asked me before.
Like, how do you balance those elements?
So I think what's good about being able to understand those visual elements, whether it's the climber, the rock architecture, or the setting that you want to emphasize, once I sort of, after 30 years, kind of understood these visual elements and way to describe them better, it's just a question of sometimes you're responding in the moment and other times you're doing something more conceptual. So, yeah, I think that's where I like it. It's come up with a concept and then work out how to make the best photo from this entire area, that's it. And that sort of led on to me developing different apparatus to try and get cameras into crazy positions and things like that.
Let's talk a little bit about that, because I watched a video on your YouTube channel where you show off all of this crazy setup. I mean, you've got like a camera with all of these wires attached to it and like pulley systems and cams and all kinds of craziness. So like, talk to us about some of the lengths you go to get some of these photographs.
Yeah, so that YouTube video, that's my latest remote control camera setup that I've been playing with, and I've been playing around with these new sort of setups for the last year, and it's basically incorporating a gimbal into it using ropes. But that's just the latest. I've been playing with different things since the early days, because one of the biggest problems you have in climbing photography, if you're working on a cliff, like if that's the cliff and you're abseiling down the cliff and you're trying to take photographs of someone, well, sometimes the best angle isn't like just on the cliff. You actually want to be sort of out from the cliff sometimes to get a perspective looking down to capture that sort of rock architecture. So, and if the cliff's vertical and there's nothing there to attach another rope to pull out, or you can't get out. So I started off in 1998. I designed like this massive aluminium A-frame apparatus, and I had it fabricated and I hung it off the side of a cliff and I pulled myself out on it, and that enabled me to get an angle looking in. But it was so much work to set up and use, and when you set it up you can't change anything quickly. So after quite a few years, as camera technology kind of evolved a bit, I realised, well, now you can get a digital feed from the camera. I don't need to be out on the end of a frame or a pole. The camera can, and as soon as you're not dealing with the weight of a human body, the rigging and everything gets a lot easier. So I developed a pole, basically an 8 metres long painter's pole with a camera hanging off the end, and the pole was attached by guy ropes, and I'd abseil down the cliff with it and hold the camera out on the end of this 8 metre pole and hope the wind didn't smash it into the rock. And I actually got some really good shots with that. My favourite was from Devil's Tower, up north from you, up in Wyoming. That beautiful columns you get on Devil's Tower. I've been thinking about that for years. Like, how do I show that? And yeah, it works. But it's very fiddly. So what I realised recently is now with remote control technology and gimbals, you can have much better control. And so I've been playing around with a couple of different setups. And the one you saw in that YouTube video is the craziest one. It's basically you string a rope between two cliff tops, and once you get a rope between two cliff tops, and you can get the camera out on a pulley system, and the camera is hanging off a frame, and it's got the gimbal and it's like a Nikon Z8 on the setup, and it's all controlled remotely through the DJI app, which is very fiddly, but it kind of works. And so therefore the theory is you can get a camera into places you physically couldn't get a person. Abseil, there's just places you can't get to and you don't want to get to, or are uncomfortable to get to, or scary to get to. So the idea with this is you can string it between two cliffs like that. The main one I've been working on is just stringing a rope from a cliff top to the ground. This is quite a common situation in rock climbing, maybe a flat ground, a 30-metre high cliff. And once you get a rope to the top, you can then haul up your camera on a pulley, and just control it remotely. And so that's what I've been playing with. You can set it up without having to abseil or hang off the side of a cliff for hours, and you just have the camera sitting there ready to shoot when the climber comes up. And it's just been fun. So that's what I've been playing around with, and it's been really interesting.
I wanted to ask you like kind of the most obvious question, but why not just use a drone?
Oh, do I have to answer that? No, I actually do use a drone. I've got a Mavic Pro Mini 4, which is cool because it's got the vertical orientation for the framing.
Yeah.
Which is you can use that quite a lot in rock climbing shots.
Right.
But what I found a drone really good for, I use them for taking photographs for my guidebooks, for the cliffs, for guidebooks. But what I found them good for in climbing photography is just reconnoitering, like scoping things out. And you can just position the drone where you might want to position yourself or a camera using ropes or something and see what the angle looks like. And that recently has, to me, been really good. But yeah, for your ultimate shot, do I really want it taken from a drone, even though it's probably going to be a lot easier in some situations? No. And, there are places you can't use a drone. Sure. They are annoying. And it's just something disconnected about it. Like, hanging a remote camera.
Well, and there's something to be said for pulling off feats that require engineering and ingenuity and technical expertise to get the camera into the right spot at the right time versus just launching it and using a joystick and putting it where you want it. I mean, I think there's probably a sense of pride and satisfaction that comes from that.
Yeah, there's, if you're
not to mention image quality, right?
Well, absolutely image quality. But I mean, every argument I seem to have had against drones for the last 5 years seems to get, technologically demolished every little while. Like I said, one of the problems I had with drones as a stills photographer was that most sensors are horizontal. And now, of course, they brought out a drone that you can just flick it to vertical, and it's like, oh, okay, there goes that argument. But image quality, lens, yeah. But there's just something different about that process. And if you're a rock climber, you should, I would hope, understand something about the value of style, right? So in rock climbing, the style in which you climb in is important to a lot of people. It's photography. It's the challenge is to physically get a high-end camera into position, and preferably, visualize something and maybe create something that hasn't been done before, hasn't been thought of before, or couldn't be done before without that technology. That's really cool.
Totally agree. I mean, there's some scenes here in Colorado that I have a long time been wanting to capture, and it's a challenging climb to get to those destinations. I could have launched a drone from 1,000 feet below or whatever and gotten it and much easier, but I don't think I would have been quite as happy with the end result.
But what does that mean commercially? Like, if you're trying to be a professional, and does just the image count, or does that process count?
I guess it depends on what you value in photography, right? Like, obviously we all have to put food on the table, but at the end of the day, I think for me anyway, I can only speak for myself, but there's a lot that I value in terms of like accomplishment, and there's the physicality of some of the things that I like to photograph. I think that gets woven into kind of what I love about those images. Doesn't mean like they're the world's best photographs, but like I have a lot more pride and I feel better about them, I guess.
Well, this harks back to when I told you I failed that portfolio at night school, and it was the nudes on rocky beaches that did really well. And I thought, wow, yeah, okay, I can wander along a rocky beach and turn it into a black and white and get someone to take their clothes off. That's great. But hiking into a cliff and climbing and abseiling and ascending and hanging around uncomfortably and trying to get a shot, and then you can get a shot, but can you get a good shot? It's a lot of work. And I think it's always been a personal challenge anyway. So the drone's there to make it easier, but I just see it as a tool, and it's not the ultimate tool. I think it's part of my tool kit, and it's great for video. But the remote camera stuff's just fascinating to me. You can get remote cameras into places you can't get drones. You can leave it hanging all day. It doesn't have to bother anyone. I would be interested to see if landscape photographers could take some of this, would take remote camera stuff and use it in landscape photography, like hanging a camera between two sides of a gorge to get a perspective down a gorge that no one's...
Most people I know would be like, I'm just going to fly my drone. But to your point, I mean, it does add a completely different layer and complexity and planning into the mixture that I think a lot of people do enjoy about landscape photography.
Yeah.
So I could totally see that. Yeah.
But the rope stuff's, kind of complicated, but you can also have a camera on a pole. That's another thing I've been playing with. So having like an 8 or 10 metre long pole, carbon fibre pole, and then have the gimbal and camera on the top of that. And then you can just control it beautifully. And I mean, that's got applications for landscape photography for sure.
Oh, yeah. I know a lot of people who use that exact toolkit for photographing off of boats, like in the Arctic and Antarctic, like sticking the pole right down to the surface of the water and getting that really nice photograph of the penguin that's right there, even with the boat, those kind of things. But that also, I don't know, there's an element of like, I hope you don't drop your camera.
Well, I nearly smashed my Z9 when I was prototyping how to attach the camera to the gimbal, because what happens is that to stabilise it, it gets quite a twist going on the gimbal. And so the whole rigging trick that I found with these setups was making sure the gimbal was attached to the pulley system properly. And I went through all these prototypes, and I had one hanging off the back veranda and off the back porch, and the thing started vibrating and just untwisted, and the Z9 just dropped.
Yeah.
And luckily I'd sort of been also experimenting with different safety lines to catch the camera, and the camera strap held and pulled it up about that far off the concrete. I'm like, that could have been expensive.
Yeah. Well, for people listening who mostly like to shoot landscapes, I'd be curious to hear you talk a little bit about what you feel like they could learn from climbing photography, including like adding the human element in big wild settings, or anything else that you think maybe we could take away from your style of work.
Yeah, I've always been a little jealous of landscape photographers who don't need to have a climber in the images. It's an extra thing to have to deal with, isn't it? It does restrict you, because obviously you're looking at photographing, you have to photograph a climb, not just a landscape. But also that probably has its advantages, because it kind of gives you direction for your photography. I sell photographic prints, like climbing prints, and I sell a few landscapes, but I always have found landscape images, at least as a print, to have more of a market than an image with a climber in it. Climbing photographs have a lot of commercial uses, but for a high-end image, what you want on your wall, do you want a human element?
I go back and forth. I think sometimes it can help show scale, but it also can be a little bit distracting. One of the better photographs I've seen is from a guy who I'm mentoring currently, and he and his girlfriend just did like a hike through the redwoods, and it was just like one of those perfect moments where like there was a beam of light shining down on her. She's standing below this massive redwood tree that's probably like 20 meters around, and including her in the scene creates so much more scale and perspective. I really enjoy that about that, but it has to be done tastefully.
Absolutely. It cannot be posed. It's just got to feel natural. That's one of the things I like about photographing climbers, because when you're photographing, they're right in the moment. I mean, that's the ideal photograph is not posed in my mind.
Right, like they're in the middle of like reaching for a hard hold or something.
Yeah, you can, as a climber, you can kind of tell if someone's sort of doing something you wouldn't normally be doing, hanging off with one hand, sort of all casual with 20 feet of rope out. And it's just like, okay. Yeah, if it's going to end up on a motivational poster kind of thing, it might be gone a bit too far. I think there's something really natural about it. It's funny you mentioned the word scale, because when I was looking at the chapters, when we were trying to come up with the artistic themes for the Art of Climbing book, one of the ideas, I was trying to think of artistic themes. So I came up with chapters. One was silhouettes and the other was scale. And the idea with scale is that they were photographs where you had a really big cliff and you wouldn't be able to tell the scale except for the fact that there was a climber in it. So maybe just little Where's Wally, little dots of climbers. But, oh, wow, okay, I can see the climbers. Oh, that's a big cliff. And the climbers are what gave it the scale. So that was one of the ways I split up my work. And I found I had a whole series that were kind of like that. Yeah. So I don't know what to tell landscape photographers for that. I learn a lot from looking at landscape photography, and I always think, geez, if I could get a climbing photograph that's really high end, like a really high end landscape photograph like Matt, then add the human element. That's kind of what I strive for, yeah. On that style of shot, the one where the landscape is the important element and not just the climber or the architect.
Right. I'd be curious, like when you're photographing climbing images, what kind of concepts from landscape photography are you borrowing when you compose your climbing photos?
Well, you'll have to tell me what the concepts are, man. I can tell you which ones I've borrowed.
I feel like one that's kind of obvious is lines and leading lines and things of that nature. When you're above a climber looking down, I feel like the natural kind of perspective of looking down the cliff is going to pull the viewer down to the main subject, which is obviously the climber in that particular instance.
I think a lot of the time the angles you would be using to photograph rock climbing are probably normally quite different to landscape photography. Like, as you're saying, the classic climbing photograph is kind of taken with a wide angle lens from maybe 10 feet away from the climber looking down on them. So you can see their face as they look up, you can see what both of their hands are on, and you can see down the climb where they've come from, where the rope goes, the protection. You learn a lot as a climber looking at a photo taken like that, and that's a very common aspect. You're only doing it because the climber is so important. So again, those shots which are where the setting is the really important element, where I go, wow, this is such a stunning setting, I would be, derelict as a photographer not to show this amazing location that you can go climbing in. So that's where I start to think more as a landscape photographer. And they're often more, typical perspective. And you are, to show the human figure in the frame, you really need them to stand out. So you've often quite got to have them on an edge, like an arête or a silhouette in a cave or something. So the element might be small, but they really need to stand out, and they can't just be blended in and lost against the rock. You then have limitations on your angles and how you can get that, and the climb has to go there and the climber has to go there.
I figure too, like in landscape photography, there's a lot of thought, at least in my mind, often subconsciously, but there's a lot of thought in terms of like, how much sky am I including here? How much foreground? How much midground? If I'm looking down a valley or something like that, like how much of what's right in front of me do I include? And then conversely, like when you're doing a climbing photo, you still have to just choose like how much of the cliff face am I including? How much of the empty space beyond the climber am I including? For you, that there's probably somewhat of a subconscious process going on where you're kind of like evaluating the elements, figuring out visual weight, and then deciding like, okay, I need to include this much of that and this much of that, and everything just kind of feels copacetic.
Yeah, it depends on the situation, whether you're documenting something and just working really fast, or you got time to play around and different lenses and angles. You often end up with a situation, like sometimes it's just you're in a physically hard situation to be in. It's very uncomfortable. You're hanging off a rope. You might be under an overhang.
Right.
You're not 100% happy about what your rope's rubbing against up there.
Yes.
To stop yourself swinging in space, you connected a rope there, and the climber's coming up, and you're trying to change lens without dropping anything, and you're hanging there in your harness and chest harness, and sometimes you're just lucky just to get a photograph. I mean, so yeah, your finer considerations of high art landscape photography isn't probably top of mind in those moments. But so yeah, as the climber comes up, you might be using a long lens to separate them, and as they come up closer, you might be going wide or something, and sometimes you're just happy to have got a shot at all. So yeah.
So it sounds more like your thought process is don't die, don't drop anything, maybe get a good photo.
Yeah.
Which sounds
first.
good. I mean, I like that approach. I think that works well.
But the fun stuff, like I say, is when you have a vision for a shot and you work on it for days. There's one that I sent you with the inversion layer.
Oh, yeah.
In the Blue Mountains, and it's got a cliff on the side there. And the climber is a really good mate of mine who's passed away, and so it's got that sentimental value. But we worked for days on that shot. And I live in the Blue Mountains, and I said to myself, what is one of the unique things about the Blue Mountains is these inversion layers you get in the valleys in the morning. And so I thought about this for years because there's not many cliffs that get the sun in the morning where you're going to get that inversion layer. And eventually figured it out, and we probably had 4 false starts before we got a good inversion and got out there and nailed that shot. So that whole process to me felt a lot more sort of landscapey kind of. We finally got the light and the inversion.
Right. Well, earlier we did touch on your YouTube channel, which I think is called Simon Carter No Filter. What can people expect to find there, and what are you planning on doing with your channel?
The first one was a remote control camera setup. We're working on the second one now, which is another remote control camera setup, but a bit simpler. And I'll do some tech tips. We'll do behind the scenes, just go out on shoots. And the channel's called Simon Carter No Filter. It's climbing photography life. So be a lot of stuff about climbing photography. But I also hopefully will grow it. It's not really happening because my girlfriend, she's American and she's been out in Australia for about 7 years. And she used to go around filming flat track motorbike racing in America. And she started a channel called Flat Track Live on Facebook, and it's got like 500,000 followers. And so she's always been into like documenting stuff. So we're doing the channel really because of her. We've got a little Osmo pocket camera and she's just using that. And so I don't really have to do anything. I'm just doing my photo shoots and talking occasionally, and she's going to come out and document it. And we'll bring others into the show and climbers, photographers, and try and make it a bit interesting. And the other really big thing is we got going on is that I live here in the Blue Mountains. I've just sold this house, and by the time this airs, I've probably moved to the Grampians, 12 hours away. And
Oh,
the Grampians
wow.
is this. Do you know it?
No, but I mean, a 12-hour move is no joke.
Oh yeah, it's interstate. So Blue Mountains to near Sydney down to Western Victoria, 4 hours from Melbourne. But the Grampians is a national park, and it's a beautiful natural Australian bushland with these spectacular orange cliffs. And quite a few of my best photographs are from there because it was my early inspiration. So I feel like after 29 years, I'm returning to where I started. That's where I started my business, down there 29 years ago. And I bought this beautiful property, and we're moving down there with my girlfriend. And so we're going to keep doing YouTubes. We're going to go out into the Grampians and Mount Arapiles taking photos. And the property is called Kangaroos in the Top Paddock, and you get all the kangaroos coming down through the property in the evening. So I'll probably start doing kangaroo photography, and and I'll definitely be doing a lot of landscape photography because the Grampians is just stunning
Awesome.
place for landscapes. And yeah.
Well, for people who want to learn more about your book, how can they pick up a copy?
Oh, just Google The Art of Climbing or go to my website, onsite, onsite.com.au. Yeah, check it out. I'd love to hear what landscape photographers think of some of the concepts in that, actually.
I'm sure that anyone listening will get a lot out of checking it out. So we'll make sure we'll put links to everything in the show notes. So one more question for you, Simon. Who's someone that you recommend for the podcast? Who's someone that we should know about?
Oh, definitely Jim Thornburg. He's a climbing photographer out of San Francisco, and he's been at the game probably longer than I have. So he's probably started in the early 90s. I think his name has always been around as long as I have. And he's still going strong. He never gave up, and he never lost his focus, his compass of just photographing rock climbing. And so his documentation of North American rock climbing is second to none. And he's got a beautiful eye. His images are really raw and authentic, and he just writes lovely stuff about it. So, yeah, absolute shout out to Jim Thornburg. He is a legend in my mind. Yeah,
Love
respect.
it. Well, Simon, this was a lot of fun.
Thank you, Matt. Yeah, it's been awesome. Thank you so much for having me on.
Yeah, of course. Thanks for joining me for another great episode of F-Stop, Collaborate, and Listen with this week's guest, Simon Carter. If you enjoyed today's conversation, I want to take a moment to remind you that this podcast operates on the value for value model, meaning if you get anything out of the show, I ask that you give something back in return. It's how we keep the lights on, cover the costs of production, and ensure that these in-depth conversations can continue to happen week after week. We've seen a drop in Patreon support recently, and the truth is, This show can't continue without listener contributions. You can join for as little as a few dollars a month, and in return, you'll get access to over 250 bonus episodes, early releases, and other extras. Just visit patreon.com/fstopandlisten or click the link in the show notes to sign up. Your support really does make all the difference. Thanks for stopping in, collaborating with us, and listening. See you next week.